She was 7 months pregnant alone in the Montana wilderness, driving nails into raw timber with cracked and bleeding hands, and she did not stop. Not when the hammer slipped. Not when the pain shot through her back. Not when the men from town rode past and laughed without slowing down. She did not cry. She did not ask for help. She just drove the next nail in. If that kind of strength moves you, subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1884 came to the Montana high country like a punishment. The sun arrived before dawn and stayed long past the hour when decent people went inside. It pressed down on the grass until the color bled out of it, turned the creek beds to cracked mud, and made the pine trees smell like they were already starting to burn. It was the kind of heat that broke things equipment tempers animals men. It did not break Cecilia May Hargrove. She swung the hammer at 6 in the morning when the air still carried a trace of the night's coolness. She swung it at noon when the sun was directly overhead and the shadow she cast was no bigger than a fence post. She swung it at 4 in the afternoon when the heat rose off the rocky ground in visible waves and her dress clung to her back like a second skin. 7 months along her belly, round and firm beneath a work apron, she had cut down and re-sewn 3 times to fit her changing shape. And she drove nails into raw timber with the kind of focus that looks from the outside, like a woman who has simply decided not to feel pain anymore. The land she was building on sat at the eastern edge of a narrow valley, 3 miles from the nearest town of Harlow Creek. It was 40 acres of hard ground that nobody had wanted, too rocky on one side, too exposed on the other, no shade to speak of, and a seasonal creek that ran strong in spring and thin as a whisper by August. The man at the county office had looked at her across his desk when she slid the payment across, and he had looked at her the way men in that county looked at things that didn't make sense to them. "This land's been sitting 15 years, he'd said. "You understand why?" "I understand it's mine now," she'd said. "Stamp the paper, please." He stamped it. She had arrived in Harlow Creek 6 weeks earlier with a wagon, 2 mules, a trunk of tools, a small store of food, and no explanation that she offered to anyone. She was 24 years old. She wore no ring. She was visibly, unmistakably carrying a child. And she spoke to people in town only when she needed something, lumber, nails, rope, and paid for everything in cash that she counted out carefully from a worn leather pouch she kept inside her boot. The town talked. Of course the town talked. The women talked first. The way women in small towns always do, in the quick, low exchanges that happen between the dry goods shelf and the door, in the whispers that pass between houses when laundry is being brought in. They said she was the widow. They said she wasn't. They said the father of the child was a man back east who had left her. They said she had left him. They said things about her character that were cruel and specific, and almost entirely invented the way small-town speculation always is built from 1 or 2 real facts and the rest pure imagination. The men took longer. Men in Harlow Creek didn't gossip in the same way. They observed. They evaluated. And then when they had made up their minds, they said their piece directly. The way men in that part of Montana understood directness, which meant without any particular concern for how it landed. The hardware store owner, a wide man named Dolph Garrett, had looked at the lumber she was buying. Good. A serious quantity, not what you bought. If you were just patching something, and he'd said, "You building a structure, a cabin," she said, "and eventually a barn." Alone. Yes. He'd been quiet a moment. Then, "Ma'am, I'll sell you whatever you want to buy. That's my business. But I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't tell you that what you're describing isn't something a woman in your condition ought to be attempting." Cecilia had looked at him with an expression that was not angry. It was something quieter than anger and more final. "My condition," she said, "is that I own land and I need lumber. How much for the full order?" He told her. She paid. She loaded the wagon herself. Ethan Cole Barrett had been riding the eastern edge of his property line for 2 hours when he first saw her. I was not in a charitable mood. He had been up since 4 in the morning dealing with a section of fence that his best bull had knocked through sometime in the night, and 3 of his cattle had gone through the gap before any of his hands found it at first light. He'd spent the better part of the morning tracking the strays back through rough country, and now in the brutal afternoon heat, he was doing a sweep of the eastern boundary to make sure there weren't more gaps he didn't know about. Ethan Barrett was 38 years old and had owned the Barrett Mountain Ranch for 12 of those years, having inherited it from a father who had won it from nature through something close to brute force, and then worked himself into an early grave trying to hold it. The ranch was 2,000 acres, ran 300 head of cattle, employed 6 full-time hands, and had a reputation in Harlow Creek for producing some of the strongest stock in that part of Montana. It was a serious operation. Ethan ran it seriously. He was not by nature a man who stopped to observe things that were not his business. But when he crested the low ridge at the eastern boundary and looked down into the narrow valley and saw what was happening on the 40-acre parcel that had sat empty for as long as he could remember, he stopped. The woman was up on the wall frame. That was the first thing that registered, and it registered as something close to alarm because she was 7 months pregnant by the look of her, and she was standing on a crossbeam 8 feet off the ground, driving a nail into a rafter joint with short, precise strokes. No rope, no spotter, just her and the hammer and the open air beneath her feet. Ethan sat on his horse for a long moment and watched. She was good. That was the second thing he registered, and it surprised him more than the first. He had built things with his own hands: fence posts, outbuildings, the repair work that never stopped on a working ranch, and he could recognize competence from a distance. The way she set the nail before she struck it, the angle of her wrist, the way she shifted her weight on the beam when she needed to reposition careful without being tentative. She knew what she was doing. She came down off the wall frame the same way she'd been up there without drama testing each handhold before she committed to it, stepping off the last plank to the ground with the sideways step of a woman who had been navigating her own changed center of gravity for months. Then she looked directly at him. He hadn't moved. His horse hadn't moved. And yet she had known he was there. She stood at the base of her half-built cabin wall and looked up at him on the ridge with an expression that was not startled and not welcoming. It was the look of a woman who had learned to assess threats before she decided anything else. He'd seen that look before. He'd seen it on men who had survived things. He rode down the slope toward her because riding away after that kind of eye contact would have felt cowardly, and Ethan Barrett was not a coward whatever else might be said about him. He came to within 30 feet of her and stopped, touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." "You're on the Barrett property line," she said. Her voice was even, informational, not accusatory. "Your eastern boundary ends at those 3 pines." He looked at the pines she indicated. She was right to within a few feet. "You've surveyed," he said, "before I bought the land." She looked at him steadily. "I'm Cecilia Hargrove. This is my property. Ethan Barrett." He looked at the framing she'd done. It was solid work for one person. More than solid. "You've been building long, 6 weeks." He did the math in his head. The foundation, the floor joists, the subfloor, the wall frames, and now the rafter work. 6 weeks of that alone in this heat in her condition. He had built an outbuilding once with 2 experienced hands helping him, and it had taken 10 days. He didn't say any of that. He said, "Water source. Seasonal creek. Runs thin this time of year. There's a spring about 400 yards northeast on the boundary. Barrett land, but the water law in this county allows neighboring use of natural springs for domestic need." He paused. "You to be within your rights to use it." Something shifted in her expression very slightly. Not gratitude exactly, more like the recalibration of an initial assessment. "I didn't know that," she said. "Most people don't." He looked at the rafter work again. "That joint's going to need a gusset plate. With the wind we get through this valley in August, that rafter angle won't hold without it." She looked at the joint, looked back at him. "I know," she said. "I'm getting to it." He almost smiled. He didn't quite. "Good day, Miss Hargrove," he said, and turned his horse. He rode back toward his eastern fence line, but he didn't push the horse to a fast pace, and he didn't stop thinking about the joint, or the water, or the way she'd looked at him from the base of that wall. She thought about him for 3 days before she admitted it to herself. Not about him exactly. About what he'd said. The water spring to the northeast 400 yards and the right of use under county water law. She'd known about water rights in general. She had done her research before buying this land with the same thoroughness. She did everything sitting in the county records office for 2 full afternoons reading documents until the clerk got visibly impatient. But she hadn't known about the spring. And that gap in her knowledge bothered her because gaps were dangerous, and dangerous things cost you. She found the spring on the second morning. It was exactly where he'd said it was, coming up clean and cold, from the base of a rock shelf, pooling in a natural hollow, before it ran northeast toward the Barrett property. She filled her 2 largest canteens and stood there for a moment in the early morning quiet, listening to the water, and thought about the fact that a stranger on a horse had told her something useful without attaching a condition to it. In her experience, people, men in particular, did not give you useful information without attaching a condition to it. She thought about that on the walk back, and she did not trust the thought. Dolph Garrett's son, a boy of about 20, named Curtis, who worked in the hardware store and liked the sound of his own voice, considerably more than the situation warranted, said something to her on the Friday of her 3rd week. She had come in for nails and a new saw file. She was paying for them at the counter when she became aware of Curtis and 2 of his friends near the back of the store, and she became aware of them. The way you become aware of a sound that isn't quite right, not by looking directly at it, but by the change in the quality of the air. Reckon she's got a fella coming to help, or reckon she's just going to hammer herself into labor up there, one of the friends said. He wasn't quite whispering. He intended to be heard. Curtis laughed. She's got more grit than sense, I'll say that. But grit don't hold a roof up. Cecilia set her monies on the counter. She counted it twice, which was what she always did, not because she couldn't do the arithmetic, but because she had learned that being precise and deliberate in small things communicated something about how precise and deliberate she was in all things. Then she picked up her package and turned and looked at Curtis with an expression that made him stop laughing. Your roof, by the way, she said pleasantly, has a problem with the flashing around the north chimney. You can see the water staining on the interior wall from the alley window. If you don't get someone up there before the August rains come, you'll be replacing more than flashing. She paused. Just something I noticed. She walked out. Behind her, she heard Dolph Garrett's voice say something low and sharp to his son, and then the sound of her boot heels on the boardwalk, and then nothing but the street. The second time Ethan Barrett came to her property, he didn't ride up to the ridge and wait. He came straight down to where she was working the floor inside the cabin, fitting the last section of subfloor that she'd been trying to manage alone for 2 days, and he stepped off his horse without being invited and said, "That board's running long on the east wall side. You'll have a gap you can't close." She looked up at him from the floor. He was in the doorway, or what would become the doorway once she hung the door, with his hat in his hand and the afternoon light behind him. "I know," she said. "You need a second set of hands to hold it while you scribe the cut." She sat back on her heels and looked at him for a moment. "I haven't asked for help, Mr. Barrett." "No," he said. "You haven't." He was quiet a moment. "I'm offering it. There's a difference." She considered that. She was good at distinguishing between things that were true and things that were being said to seem true, and she had been considering that distinction for most of her life. What she heard in his voice was not the particular quality that meant someone wanted something from you. It was something else, closer to honesty, which was its own kind of suspicious. "Why?" she said. He looked at her directly. His eyes were pale gray and difficult to read, but she'd found that difficult-to-read people were often the ones worth reading. "Because the work's going to go wrong if you do it alone and you know it," he said. "And because I can be back on my own land in an hour if you tell me to go." She looked at the board, looked at the gap it would leave. "You take direction?" she asked. "From someone who knows what they're doing?" "Yes." She got up off the floor. "Then hold that end," she said, "and hold it level. I'll tell you when." He held it level. She scribed the cut, and when the board dropped into place with a fit that was clean and exact, she allowed herself one moment of pure satisfaction. A small exhale, the kind that is neither a sigh nor a breath, but something between them before she moved to the next one. They worked for 2 hours without speaking much. She found that she didn't mind that. Most people who didn't speak much were either sullen or uncomfortable. He was neither. He was simply doing the work. When the subfloor was done, she stood and stretched her back and watched him pick up a scrap piece of lumber without being asked and begin stacking it by size against the wall where it would be out of the way. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know I don't," he said. She watched him a moment more. Then she said, "I've got coffee on a camp stove outside. It's not good coffee." "I've had worse," he said. They sat outside in the late afternoon shade, her on an upturned crate, and him on the step of his horse's stirrup, which he lowered to use as a kind of perch, and they drank bad coffee and looked at the half-built structure and said very little. The mountains were purple in the distance. The heat was finally grudgingly beginning to let go. "How far along?" he said. She considered not answering. Then she said, 7.5 months. "And you're planning to deliver here?" "I am." He was quiet a moment. "You know what you're doing." "I've delivered calves," she said. "I've helped a neighbor's wife. I've read everything I could find on the subject." She looked at him. "And yes, I know it's not the same thing. I also know it's not something I need your worry about." He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had heard something and was choosing to hear it. "Fair enough," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You going to ask about the father?" "No," he said. She had expected him to. The not asking was for reasons she couldn't entirely account for, more disarming than any question would have been. "People in town ask," she said. "I'm not people in town." She looked back at the cabin. "No," she said. "I suppose you're not." His name came up at the general store 2 days later when she was there for a bolt of muslin and a spool of thread. The woman behind the counter was named Ruth Calloway, and she was one of the few people in Harlow Creek who spoke to Cecilia without a particular quality of careful distance in her voice. Ruth was perhaps 50, stout, with quick eyes, and the kind of face that had stopped performing warmth a long time ago, and was simply warm instead. "Heard Ethan Barrett helped out on your place," Ruth said. "Not gossip, just information offered in a practical spirit." "He held a board," Cecilia said. Ruth looked at her over the roll of muslin she was measuring. "He don't do that kind of thing," she said. "What kind of thing?" "The helping kind." Ruth set the muslin on the counter. "Ethan Barrett has worked that ranch alone with hired hands. I mean, not family, not friends, for 12 years. Since his wife died." Cecilia said nothing. She was listening. "Clara Barrett," Ruth said. "She was a good woman. Died in the 3rd year. Fever took her in the winter." Ruth folded the muslin precisely. "He didn't remarry. People thought he would. He didn't. He works. He minds his land. He comes to town when he needs something." She looked at Cecilia steadily. "He don't hold boards for people." Cecilia paid for the muslin. She thought walking back to her wagon about what it meant to stop expecting things and simply become someone who did the work. She understood that. She understood it very well. The next time he came, he brought a gusset plate. She was on the rafter again, working on a section of the roof framework, when she heard a horse below and looked down to see him dismounting with a piece of hardware in his hand. "You said you were getting to it," he said. "I was. August wind comes hard through this valley. You've got maybe 2 weeks." She came down off the rafter. He handed her the gusset plate. It was well made, the right gauge, with pre-drilled holes that would fit the joint angle she was working with. She looked at it for a moment. It was the right thing. The exact right thing, not a generic piece. He had looked at the joint from the ridge and then gone and had the right piece made. "How much?" she said. "Nothing." She looked at him. "Don't," he said. "It cost me nothing. I had the metal." "Mr. Barrett." "Ethan," he said. She looked at the plate, then at him. "Don't make a habit of this," she said. "I won't," he said, "unless you need it." She made a sound that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of a laugh. She went back up the rafter. He stayed for 3 hours that afternoon, handling things she needed a second person for, and not touching anything she was managing alone. He seemed to understand the difference without being told. She didn't know what to do with a man who understood that difference. At the end of the afternoon, when she was cleaning tools and he was readying his horse to leave, she said, "Your wife, Clara." He stopped, turned. "I heard she was a good woman," Cecilia said. Something crossed his face. It lasted less than a second, but she saw it. "She was," he said. "I'm sorry." He nodded, settled his hat. "You're going to lose that tarp on the north side tonight," he said. "Wind's turning. Tie it down to the second peg." He rowed. She went and tied down the tarp to the second peg. The wind came before midnight, and the tarp held. By the fourth week, the men who had laughed at her from the road had stopped laughing, not because they had changed their minds about her, but because the cabin was rising, and it was rising straight and solid, and there was something about competence performed in public that made ridicule increasingly uncomfortable to maintain. Even Curtis Garrett had stopped making remarks, though whether that was the result of his father's words or her remark about the flashing, which had turned out to be exactly as accurate as she said it was, she couldn't know. The woman from the neighboring farm to the south came by one afternoon. Her name was Pearl Hennessy, and she was perhaps 45, sun-browned and deliberate in her movements, with a daughter of about 12 who stayed close to her side. "I brought bread," Pearl said, "for whatever it's worth." "It's worth a great deal," Cecilia said. "Thank you." Pearl looked at the cabin, stood there a moment. "My husband helped me build ours 11 years ago," she said. "He's been gone 6. The walls he built are still standing." She looked at Cecilia. "Yours will be too." Cecilia felt something in her chest that she had been careful not to feel for a long time, because it made the things that could hurt you much clearer. She managed to hold her expression steady. "I intend them to be," she said. Pearl's daughter, whose name was May, looked at the half-built cabin with the frank evaluating gaze of a 12-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't curious. "Are you scared?" May asked. Pearl said, "May." "It's all right," Cecilia said. She looked at the girl. "Yes," she said. "Some." May considered that. "But you're still doing it." "Yes." May nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "My mama does things scared too," she said. "She says that's what brave is." Cecilia looked at Pearl. Pearl was looking at the sky with the expression of a woman who has long since made her peace with being told true things by her daughter in public. "She's right," Cecilia said. "That's exactly what it is." Ethan came 4 more times that week. Each time there was a reason. A piece of work that genuinely needed 2 people. A question about the water rights that he had looked up in the county record. A concern about a section of ground near her southeast corner that he thought might be softer than it looked. He'd seen similar ground on his property fail under weight. He brought his level on the 4th visit because she'd mentioned the door frame was giving her trouble, and a level would tell her whether the frame itself was plumb or whether the ground had shifted under the sill. She noticed that he never arrived empty-handed, and she noticed that what he brought was always exactly what was needed, and never more than that. He did not bring her food. He did not bring her medicine or comfort or concern about the baby. He brought tools and information and labor, which were the things that could be received without changing what she was. She thought about that in the evenings, after he'd gone sitting outside the cabin with her hand on her stomach and the mountains going dark around her. She had built her independence from necessity, the way you build most important things, not from a plan, but from what survival required. She had learned not to need people because needing people had cost her things she couldn't get back. And she had organized herself around that understanding so completely that it had become the architecture of how she moved through the world. But Ethan Barrett was doing something that didn't fit that architecture. He was offering her things that were useful without making her feel the weight of the offering. He was present without demanding that she account for his presence. She sat with the word for a long time before she admitted it kind. In the particular unshowy way that was rarer than any other kind. She did not know what to do with that. She knew sitting there in the evening dark that she was going to have to figure it out. Because the baby was coming in 6 weeks, and the cabin would not be finished before it came, and she was going to need something that she didn't have. She was going to need to trust someone. The question that kept her awake that night and the nights after was whether she had enough left in her, enough of the capacity that had been damaged in the breaking to do it. She put her hand on her stomach and felt the child shift. "I'm working on it," she said. The mountains were silent around her. The spring flowed 400 yards to the northeast on land that wasn't hers. And somewhere on the other side of that ridge, a man who had once loved a woman well enough to grieve her for 12 years was probably awake too for his own reasons that she didn't yet know. She would learn them. But not yet. First, she had a cabin to finish. She finished the north wall on a Thursday. She knew it was Thursday because she had been keeping a small calendar on a piece of board beside her camp stove, marking each day with a nail scratch, and she had not missed a single mark since she arrived. Keeping track of time was not sentiment. It was discipline. The baby was coming in 5 weeks, and every day had a weight to it now. The north wall went up straight. She checked it with the level Ethan had left. He had not asked for it back, and she had not offered. And the bubble sat dead center, and she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of satisfaction before she moved to the problem of the roof decking, which was going to require more lumber than she currently had, and a decision about whether she would go to town for it or send word. She went to town. She took the mule and the wagon, and she drove the 3 miles to Harlow Creek in the early morning before the heat settled in, and she went straight to Garrett's Hardware without looking at anyone or stopping for any reason, because she had learned that stopping invited conversation she didn't want, and looking at people invited opinions she hadn't asked for. She was loading the lumber onto the wagon when she heard the voice behind her. "You're still at it." She turned. The speaker was a man she hadn't seen before, or hadn't noticed, which in Harlow Creek amounted to the same thing. He was perhaps 45, well-dressed by the standards of the territory, with the particular kind of ease in his posture that came from having always had more than enough of whatever he needed. He was smiling at her with the smile of a man who was used to smiling at people from a position of advantage. "Thomas Aldrich," he said. "I own the Aldrich Cattle Company, North Range mostly. Some of the valley, too." She knew the name. Everyone in Harlow Creek knew the name the same way you knew the name of a weather pattern that caused damage. "Miss Hargrove," she said. "I know who you are." He glanced at her lumber, then at her stomach, and the glance at her stomach lasted a beat longer than it should have. "I heard you bought the Callan parcel." "I did. Interesting choice." He tilted his head. "That land's had water trouble for years. Seasonal creek, dry by August most years." "I'm aware of the water situation," she said. "Are you?" He wasn't asking. He was making a point slowly, the way men with leverage always made points, not rushing, because they had the time. "Here's the thing, Miss Hargrove. That creek that runs through the Callan parcel, your parcel now feeds from the same source as the spring on Barrett's eastern boundary. You probably know the spring. Barrett told you about it." She kept her expression level. "He mentioned it." "Right." Aldrich nodded slowly. "The thing is, I've had my eye on that water source for 3 years. There's a filing in the county office. Prior claim predates your purchase. My lawyers have been reviewing it." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm not saying there's a legal problem with your deed. What I'm saying is that the water situation on your 40 acres may be more complicated than a man on a horse told you over coffee." The precision of that over coffee told her something. It told her someone had been watching or someone had talked. She filed that information quietly and didn't react to it. "I'll look into it," she said. "You do that." He smiled again. "I also want to say, and I mean this sincerely, that what you're doing out there takes grit. Nobody's going to argue with that. But grit and a deed don't solve a water problem." He paused. "If you ever want to talk about options, a fair price for the parcel, a different arrangement, my door is open." He tipped his hat. He walked away. Cecilia finished loading her lumber. She did it slowly and without any visible change in her manner. She counted the boards as she loaded them, because counting things was what she did when she needed to think, and what she was thinking was that she needed to get to the county records office before she went back to her land, and that she needed to understand exactly what Thomas Aldrich's lawyers had filed, and when. She was in the county records office for 2 hours. When she came out, the sun was high, and her back was aching in the low, persistent way it had been aching for 2 weeks, and what she had found in the records was not what Aldrich had implied, but was also not nothing. There was a water claim filing. It was dated 4 years back. It named the spring on Barrett's eastern boundary as a claimed source for the Aldrich North Range operations. Whether it was valid depended on a section of state water law that she did not fully understand, and not fully understanding something was for Cecilia May Hargrove an emergency. She drove back to her land. She unloaded the lumber by herself. Then she sat down on an upturned crate and thought carefully and without panic about what she needed to do next. The baby moved. "I know," she said. "I know." Ethan came the following morning. He came earlier than usual before she had the camp stove going, and he came fast. Not his usual measured pace, but at something closer to a canter, pulling up short of the cabin and stepping off his horse in the way men stepped off horses when something was pressing. "Aldrich spoke to you in town," he said. She looked at him. "News travels. Ruth Calloway saw it. She told Pearl Hennessy. Pearl sent her daughter to my place." He took his hat off, pressed it against his leg. "What did he say?" "He said there's a water claim on the spring. Prior filing predating my purchase." Ethan's jaw tightened. It was the first time she had seen something that was not composed cross his face. "That filing is disputed," he said. "My lawyers had a response in with the county for 2 years. Aldrich knows that. His lawyers have been reviewing it," she said. That was his phrasing. "His lawyers review everything. He's been trying to control the water in this valley for 6 years. He got the Johnson Ranch that way, put enough legal doubt on their water source that they couldn't get the bank loan they needed, and when they went under, he bought the land for half its value." He stopped. "I should have told you about the filing when I told you about the spring." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "You should have." He took that without flinching. "I didn't think it would become relevant this fast. I didn't think he'd approach you directly." "Why not?" "Because you're—" He stopped. "Because I'm what?" she said. "A pregnant woman alone on 40 acres, not worth his attention yet." "I was going to say because you haven't been here long enough to represent a threat to him." He looked at her steadily. "But I was wrong about that. You finished half a cabin in 6 weeks. That makes you real." She considered him for a moment. "What does he actually want?" "The water, all of it. There are 3 springs in this valley. He controls one. He wants the Barrett Spring and the seasonal sources on the eastern parcels. If he gets the water, he controls what grows here, who stays and who goes." He put his hat back on. "Your land sits directly between his North Range and the Barrett Spring. You're in his way whether you know it or not." She heard the full weight of that sentence settle. "I looked at the filing," she said. "I don't fully understand the water law." "I do," he said. "Or my lawyer does, which is the same thing." He paused. "I can have him look at it with your deed. See what position you're actually in." She felt the old reflex rise. The careful, protective reflex that said, receiving help meant owing something that dependence was a door that locked behind you. She had built that reflex over years, and it had served her, and it had also, in ways, she was still accounting for cost her things. She looked at the cabin. At the north wall plumb and level. At the roof decking she had yet to begin. "All right," she said. He blinked, as if he'd expected more resistance. "All right," he repeated. "But I want to be in the room," she said. "When your lawyer looks at it, I want to understand what he's saying, not just be told the result." "That's reasonable." "And I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not helpless, Ethan. I need to be clear about that." "I know you're not." "I need you to know it every day," she said. "Not just today. Every time you come here." He looked at her for a long moment. His gray eyes were still difficult to read, but she was getting better at reading them. "I know it every day," he said. She handed him the tin of coffee that had been sitting on the camp stove since before he arrived. He took it. His lawyer's name was George Fetterman, and he operated out of a small office above the dry goods store in Harlow Creek, which meant that going to see him meant walking through the main street of town with Ethan Barrett beside her. And Cecilia was not unaware of what that would look like, or what it would mean by the time it had traveled through the 3-degree network of gossip that connected everyone in Harlow Creek to everyone else. She went anyway, because the water question was more important than other people's interpretations. Fetterman was a thin man of perhaps 60, with an ink-stained right hand and the careful, deliberate speech of someone who had learned that being precise in language was more valuable than being fast. He listened to everything she said without interrupting. He read both documents, the Aldrich filing and her deed, with the same slow precision. He asked her 4 questions, all of them specific, and she answered all 4. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "Miss Hargrove, the Aldrich claim is real, but it's not settled. It's been disputed on the grounds that the filing predates confirmed survey data. If the survey data I have here is current, and it appears to be, then Aldrich's claim on the spring is in a contested gray area. It's not invalid, but it's also not sufficient to affect your deed or your right of domestic use." He folded his hands. "What he's doing is managing perception, making you feel uncertain so you make a decision he benefits from." "He said his lawyers are reviewing it," Cecilia said. "His lawyers are always reviewing something. That's what they're paid to do." Fetterman looked at her steadily. "My professional opinion is that your position is sound, but this will not resolve cleanly. Aldrich will make it complicated. It will take time, and time may be something you are—" He glanced briefly carefully at her, short on at the moment. "I'm aware of the timeline," she said. "Then my advice is to document everything. Every visit, every conversation. If Aldrich makes any approach to you that could be construed as pressure or interference, I want it in writing immediately." He looked at Ethan. "And your water right letter, I'll have an update drafted by Thursday." They came down the stairs from Fetterman's office and out onto the main street, and the first person Cecilia saw was Curtis Garrett standing in the doorway of his father's hardware store with 2 of his usual companions. Curtis looked at her, looked at Ethan, then looked back at her with an expression that she understood immediately and refused to acknowledge. "Something to say," Ethan said. "I didn't say it loudly." He said it the way a man says something when he is very sure of where he is standing and what he is willing to do from that position. Curtis said nothing. Ethan touched the brim of his hat, and they walked on. She said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I did it anyway." She thought about what Ruth Calloway had said. "He don't do that kind of thing. The helping kind." She didn't say anything else. The baby changed position on a Wednesday night. She woke at 2 in the morning with a pressure she hadn't felt before, different from the ordinary aches that had become the background of her days. She lay still for a long time, assessing it with the same deliberate care she brought to everything, trying to determine whether this was something she needed to act on immediately or something she could monitor. She monitored it. By morning, it had eased. She got up and made coffee and assessed how she felt with the thorough, unsentimental inventory she had learned to do every morning since the 6th month, and she was fine. Or fine enough. And there was roof decking to be done. She got up on the roof. She had been up there for an hour when she heard Pearl Hennessy's wagon on the road below. Pearl came twice a week now, not invited, not uninvited, simply appearing with bread, or occasionally with her daughter May, who had developed a sustained and open interest in everything Cecilia was doing that was in its direct and uncomplicated way one of the more encouraging things in Cecilia's current life. Pearl pulled the wagon up and looked at her on the roof for a long moment. "You shouldn't be up there," Pearl said. "I know," Cecilia said. "Come up and help me then." Pearl tied off the horse, came up the makeshift ladder, a thing Cecilia had built from scrap lumber that was more solid than it looked, and spent the next 2 hours handing boards and holding one end of the chalk line, and they did not talk much, which Cecilia had learned was one of Pearl's particular qualities. Pearl talked when she had something to say. When she didn't, she was simply present, and her presence was the undemanding kind. "Aldrich came to the Fisk place yesterday," Pearl said at one point. Cecilia looked at her. "Made them an offer on their eastern 15 acres, the part with the seasonal creek." Pearl kept her eyes on the board she was holding. "They didn't sell, but they're rattled. The Fiska place was a 1/4 mile to her south. Their eastern 15 acres shared a boundary with her northern edge. If Aldrich got that land, he would have a continuous block that ran from his north range down to her property line, and the pressure on her water access would increase significantly. "What did he offer?" Cecilia said. "More than it's worth. Not so much that it was insulting." Pearl looked at her. "He's good at this." "I know he is." They worked in silence for a time. "Did you tell Ethan?" Pearl said. "Not yet." "You should tell him." "I know I should." Pearl didn't push. That was another thing Cecilia had learned to appreciate about her. She said the thing once, and then left it where it was. May was the same way in the frank and direct manner of 12-year-olds, and Cecilia had thought more than once that Pearl had done something genuinely difficult, right in raising that girl. "Can I ask you something?" Pearl said. "Go ahead. Why here, not the parcel? I mean, why Montana? Why this particular choice out of everything you could have chosen?" Cecilia thought about that for a moment. She thought about what she was willing to say, which was always a slightly different question from what was true. "My family had land in Kentucky," she said. 40 acres, not unlike this. We farmed it for 3 generations. She set a nail and drove it. "I watched my father lose it when I was 17. Not to bad farming. To a man who wanted the water rights to the creek that ran through the lower field." She paused. "He made it complicated until my father couldn't hold on. Then he bought it for nothing." Pearl was quiet. "I swore then," Cecilia said, "that I would have land of my own, that it would have water, and that when someone tried to make it complicated—" She set the next nail, drove it flush. "I'd know enough to fight." Pearl looked at her. "You knew Aldrich was a risk when you bought this land," Pearl said. "It was not a question." "I knew there was a man like Aldrich somewhere near any land worth having," Cecilia said. "There always is." She told Ethan about the Fisk offer that evening. He had come after his own work was done in the later afternoon, and they had gotten into the habit, she wasn't sure when exactly it had become a habit, of sitting outside, when the heat finally relented, and talking through whatever needed talking through. Not always about the cabin. Sometimes about the cattle or the water law or what the summer had looked like in this valley compared to years before. He knew this land in the way that came from living on it for a long time, and she found that what he knew was useful in ways she hadn't expected because it was specific and it was true, and he did not embellish it. "If he gets the Fisk parcel," she said, "what does that change for me?" He thought about it. Genuinely thought she'd learned to recognize the quality of his thinking, which was the careful kind that didn't produce an answer until the answer was ready. "It changes the pressure," he said. "Not the legal position, but the pressure." He was quiet a moment. "He'll use proximity. He'll be close enough to make your daily operations uncomfortable. Cattle drifting onto your land, fences that move overnight, small things that add up." He looked at her. "It's what he did to the Marshfields 2 years before the Johnsons." The Marshfields sold. The Marshfields left. Different from selling. Something in his voice went flat. They left in February in a bad winter with less than they came with. Cecilia sat with that. "Then we need the Fisks to hold," she said. "Yes." "What would make them hold?" He looked at her with something she was starting to recognize as the specific kind of respect that came from someone who had revised an initial assessment. "Someone with a legal argument and the backbone to make it," he said, "and the knowledge that they're not standing alone. Can they get that? From Fetterman on the legal side." He paused. "And from whatever this valley decides it is, whether it's a place where people hold together or a place where Aldrich buys them one at a time." "What has it been?" He was quiet for a moment. "The long kind." "It's been the second kind," he said. "For a while." She looked at the cabin. The roof decking was half done. The doorframe was plumb. The north wall was solid. "Then someone needs to make it the first kind," she said. He looked at her. "You've been here 6 weeks," he said. Not an objection. More like he was considering the shape of it. "Long enough to own land and have a stake in it," she said. Something shifted in his expression. She'd seen it happen before in the way of a man who had been holding a fixed opinion and had just been given a reason to loosen his grip on it. "All right," he said. "All right. I'll talk to the Fisks," he said. "You should come." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because they need to see that it's not just me," he said. "That it's the land around them, not one man telling them to hold." He met her gaze directly. "They need to see you." She hadn't expected that. She sat with the unexpectedness of it for a moment, the way you sit with something that doesn't fit the shape of what you thought you understood. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow." The Fiska place was a working farm of some competence. She could see that plainly from the condition of the fences and the way the yard was kept. Ed Fisk was perhaps 50, a lean, careful man who reminded her of her father in the way he moved around his own property, as if every inch of it were something he had personally negotiated with the earth. His wife Nora was younger by some years, and she watched Cecilia with a frank and evaluating look that Cecilia returned without discomfort. Because women who looked at you that way were generally the kind worth knowing. They sat at the Fiska kitchen table, and Ethan laid out the legal position as Fetterman had explained it. Ed Fisk listened with his hands flat on the table. Nora listened with her eyes on Cecilia. When Ethan finished, Ed said, "Aldrich says the filing's clear." "Aldrich says what's useful to him," Ethan said. "Fetterman says it's contested and the survey data supports the contest." Ed looked at the table. "Last time someone in this valley contested Aldrich, it took 2 years and most of their savings." "I know," Ethan said. Silence. Then Nora Fisk said, "Miss Hargrove, you bought the Callan parcel." "I did," Cecilia said. "Alone." "Yes." Nora looked at her steadily. "You knew what you were buying into?" "I knew there would be someone like Aldrich," Cecilia said. "There's always someone like Aldrich when the land is worth having." "And that didn't stop you?" "No." Nora looked at her husband. Ed Fisk was still looking at the table, but he was listening. She could see that in the set of his shoulders. He was a man working something through. "What happens to your land?" Ed said, still looking at the table. "If we sell the Eastern 15. "I don't know exactly," Cecilia said. "I know it gets harder. And if we don't sell," she looked at him, "then we find out what this valley is willing to do together." Ed Fisk lifted his eyes from the table. He looked at her for a long moment. "My grandfather broke this ground," he said. 1861. "I know," she said. "Ruth Calloway told me." Something in his face changed. The particular way a man's face changes when he realizes he is being seen by someone who thought it was worth learning who he was before asking anything of him. "We're not selling," he said. Nora's shoulders dropped a half-inch. The kind of drop that is not weakness, but relief, the exhale of someone who had been waiting to see which way the weight would fall. "Thank you," Cecilia said. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. He was watching Cecilia with the expression she still had trouble fully reading, and she had given up trying to read it quickly. Whatever it was not simple. They rode back in the early evening, her on the wagon, and him on his horse beside it, and they didn't speak for a long stretch of the road. The heat was softening into something that was almost bearable. The mountains were doing the thing they did in the evening light, the way they seemed to hold it longer than the valley staying gold, while everything below went gray. "How did you know about her grandfather?" Ethan said. "I asked Ruth," she said. "Last week. I asked her about every family within 3 miles. He was quiet. "You've been gathering information," he said. "I've been doing what I always do," she said. "Learning where I am before something makes it matter." He rode for a moment. "Miss Hargrove," he said. "Cecilia," she said. He didn't say anything right away. Then, Cecilia. It was the first time he'd used her name. She wasn't sure in the gathering dusk whether the warmth she felt at that was something she should account for carefully, or something she should simply allow. She allowed it. Just for the moment. Just for the length of the road home. The cabin was there when she got back, standing in the last of the light. The roof decking caught the angle of it and held it. The north wall was straight. The door frame was plumb. She sat in the wagon for a moment after Ethan had gone looking at it. It did not look impossible anymore. That was something she had not allowed herself to notice before, because noticing the distance you'd traveled meant acknowledging how far you still had to go, and she had trained herself to look at the destination rather than the road. But tonight, she looked at the road, and then she looked at the hand she had placed on her stomach without thinking, and she felt the child shift beneath it, and she thought about the Fisk kitchen table, and the way Ed Fisk had said his grandfather broke this ground in 1861, and the way Nora Fisk's shoulders had dropped when he said they weren't selling. She thought about what Ethan had said. They need to see you. Not the cabin. Not the deed. Her. She sat with that a long time before she went inside. The water was still contested. Aldrich was still moving. The roof wasn't done. The barn hadn't been started. The baby was coming in 4 weeks, and the nearest woman with midwifery experience was Pearl Hennessy, who had delivered 2 of her own children and 1 of her neighbors, which was better than nothing and not quite enough. There was still everything to do. But the Fisks were holding, and the valley had watched it happen, and something that did not yet have a name. She was willing to give it was shifting between her and the man who had ridden beside her wagon in the evening light and said her name like it was a decision. She went inside. She marked Thursday on the calendar board. She made a list of what still needed doing. She started at the top. The roof was finished on a Saturday. She drove the last nail at mid-morning, climbed down the ladder with the careful sideways step she had perfected over weeks of navigating her own changed body, and stood on the ground and looked up at what she had built. 4 walls, a roof, a door frame waiting for its door, windows that would get their glass before winter, a floor that was level and solid and would hold. She was 36 days from her due date. She went inside and sat down on the subfloor and did not cry, because crying was not what she did, but she sat for a long time in the quiet of the space she had made, and she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not the pride that was there, but something underneath the pride. The thing that had been driving her since before she bought the land, since before she left Kentucky, since the day she was 17 years old, and watched her father hand over the deed to 40 acres that 3 generations of her family had worked because a man with lawyers and patience had made the water question too complicated to fight. She had built 4 walls and a roof with her own hands. 8 months pregnant in Montana, summer heat on land. Nobody had wanted. She had done it. And then the cramp hit. It was not the first cramp. She had been having irregular tightening for 2 weeks, the kind the book she carried from Kentucky described as preparatory. The body rehearsing what it would eventually do in earnest. She had noted each one with the same deliberate inventory she brought to everything and assessed them as not yet urgent. This one was different. She sat very still and breathed through it and waited for it to pass, and it passed. But the passing took longer than the ones before. She counted the time on the pocket watch she kept in her apron, 1 minute and 40 seconds. She made a note of it on the board where she kept her calendar and sat back down to wait. The next one came 11 minutes later. She sat through it, counted it. 1 minute 50. She got up, walked to the door of the cabin, and looked out at the road that ran past her property toward the Barrett Ranch. The road was empty. The sun was overhead, and the heat was already serious, and there was no one on the road, and Pearl Hennessy's farm was a quarter-mile south, which in her current condition was not a short walk. She made a decision. She went to the camp stove, put water on to boil, gathered the things she had prepared, and set aside. 6 weeks ago, the clean linens, the cord, the small knife she had boiled and wrapped in cloth, the list of instructions she had written out in her own hand from everything she had read. She arranged them inside the cabin. She spread the cleanest linen she had on the floor near the south wall, where the light came in best. Then she went to the doorway again, and she said out loud into the empty afternoon, "I need someone to know where I am." She could not go to Pearl herself. Not now. Not with 11 minutes between contractions and the distance involved. She needed someone closer. She needed Ethan. He had told her 2 weeks ago that his hands started their afternoon work at 2 and worked the north fence until 4. He told her because she had asked him his schedule the same way she had asked Ruth about the neighboring families, because knowing where people were when you needed them was a practical matter, not a sentimental one. It was noon. She went to the lean-to, where she'd been keeping her mule, and she took the animal out, and she did not saddle it, because saddling it would take time. She was calculating carefully now, and she got up on it. Bareback with a difficulty that cost her more than she showed, and she rode hard toward the Barrett ranch. The third contraction came while she was riding. She stopped the mule and gripped its mane and breathed through it, counting on the pocket watch she held in her free hand, and when it passed, she kicked the mule forward again and did not slow down. She reached the Barrett ranch gate in 15 minutes and came through it at a pace that brought one of the hands a young man named Will, who she had seen twice before, running from the direction of the barn. "Miss Hargrove." "Where is he?" she said. Will read her face in the way that young men read faces when the information they see is serious and they don't want to misread it. "North fence," he said. "I'll get him," she said. "Now, tell him the baby's coming." Will ran. She sat on the mule in the Barrett yard and breathed and waited, and was very precise about what she was afraid of and what she wasn't. She was not afraid of dying. She had considered that possibility thoroughly, and had decided that she had taken every reasonable precaution, and that fear of it was not going to be useful. She was afraid of being alone when the time came. That was the one thing she had not been able to talk herself out of being afraid of, even with all the reading and the preparation and the careful practical inventory of resources. She heard hoofbeats. Ethan came around the side of the barn at a dead run on his bay horse pulled up hard in front of her, and took in the situation in the way that experienced people take in situations, fast complete, without performing the assessment out loud. "How far apart?" he said. 11 minutes when I left. I've had one on the road." Pearl Hennessy. "Yes, but I can't make it there." "You don't have to." He was already off his horse. "Come down." She came down from the mule with his hands steadying her, and she did not object to his hands because this was not the moment for that particular kind of pride, and they both understood that. "The cabin," she said. "Everything's set up there." "The ranch house is closer," he said. She shook her head. "My cabin. I want to be in my cabin." He looked at her for 1 second, just one, and then said, "Will, ride to Pearl Hennessy. Tell her Miss Hargrove needs her at the Callan parcel right now, fast as you can ride." He looked at another hand who had appeared. "Tom, get the small wagon, blankets." Then he looked at her. "Can you ride another mile?" "Yes," she said. "Then let's go." Pearl arrived 40 minutes later. In those 40 minutes, Cecilia had 2 more contractions, 9 minutes apart, then 7, and Ethan had done the things he did without being asked, which was what he always did, and she had stopped noticing how unusual it was to have a man around who didn't need to be directed toward usefulness. He had the water boiling. He had the linens arranged the way she had arranged them. He had read the list she had written out. She showed it to him without being embarrassed about it, because this was not the time for embarrassment, and he had set out each item in the order she had specified. When Pearl came through the door, she took in the scene, assessed it, and said to Ethan, "Go outside." "I'll stay if she wants me to," he said. Pearl looked at Cecilia. "Go outside," Cecilia said. He went. The labor was 14 hours. Pearl stayed the entire time. May, who had ridden with her mother, sat outside with Ethan for reasons that Cecilia would later think about and find in the rethinking, something that moved her, the image of that 12-year-old girl sitting in the summer dark beside a taciturn rancher. Both of them waiting. The silence between them probably comfortable in the particular way that silence is between people who are both constitutionally inclined to it. At 4 in the morning, a child arrived. A girl. She was small and complete, and she made a sound that was not a cry so much as an announcement, a clear and serious declaration of presence, and Pearl said, "Good girl," in the direction of the baby, and then said it again quietly in the direction of Cecilia. Cecilia held her daughter and felt something happen in her chest that she had no previous language for. She had thought she was prepared for this. She had read everything, had thought through every practical aspect, had organized herself for the event. With the same thoroughness, she organized everything. She had not been prepared for this. Not for the weight of the child in her arms. Not for the specific way she felt when the girl's hand closed reflexively around her finger. She held her daughter and did not perform what she felt because there was no one to perform it for. Pearl was working quietly at the far end of the room, and the performance of emotion had never been how Cecilia moved through the world anyway. What she felt was simply this. This was why. Pearl opened the cabin door at just past 4 in the morning and said to the dark, "It's a girl. They're both well." There was a silence. Then Ethan said from somewhere she couldn't see, "Thank God." He said it quietly, not to Pearl, the way a person says something that they are saying to themselves. When she came out to tell him he could come in, she found him standing near the east wall of the cabin, his hat in his hands, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen there before. Something that was not the composed, careful stillness he wore the way other men wore coats. Something that had slipped past that. He came inside. He stood at a respectful distance and looked at the child and looked at Cecilia and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "What's her name?" "Clara," Cecilia said. She watched his face. She had not told him she was going to use that name. She had decided it herself privately in the weeks before, for reasons she had not fully examined at the time. The name felt right for reasons that were partly about the woman it belonged to first, and partly about something she understood about choosing names that honored the dead without making the living carry them as a burden. His jaw moved. He looked at the child. His eyes went to a place she couldn't follow. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at Clara, who was asleep against Cecilia's chest, with her hand still curled, and his face did the thing she'd seen once before, on the day she mentioned his wife, that brief, almost involuntary exposure. But this time, it lasted longer. Long enough for her to see it clearly. I was grieving. Still. 12 years later, in the middle of a birth in a cabin on 40 acres of hard Montana ground. He was still grieving the woman he had loved, and he was also at the same time in a way that only seemed contradictory if you hadn't watched someone carry two true things at once, something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for. "Thank you," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "For that." She nodded. He stepped back, put his hat on. "I'll be outside," he said, "until you need something." He went outside. Pearl looked at Cecilia with the particular expression of a woman who has seen a great deal of human behavior and has learned to identify the significant moments. Cecilia looked down at the child. "Don't," she said. "I didn't say anything," Pearl said. "You were about to." Pearl made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Sleep," she said, "while she lets you." Thomas Aldrich came on the 9th day. She heard the horse on the road and looked up from where she was sitting outside the cabin door, with Clara in her arms, doing the feeding that still felt like something she was learning even as she was doing it, and she recognized the horse and the rider, and she did not change her position or her expression. He pulled up, looked at the child. Something crossed his face that was not warmth, but was performing warmth, which she had long since learned to distinguish. "I heard," he said. "Congratulations." "Thank you," she said. "A girl." "Yes." He looked at the cabin. At the finished roof, the plum door framed the level walls. His assessment was visible in the slight shift of his jaw, the way a man recalibrates when something he expected to fail has not. "I'll say it plainly," he said, "because I think you prefer plain." "I do," she said. "My water claim is moving forward. Fetterman's objections have been noted, but the county commissioner is going to take the full filing into review. That process takes time. In the meantime, your domestic use of the spring is technically in a gray area." He paused. "I'm still willing to discuss the parcel. The price I offered originally still stands." Clara made a small sound against her chest. Cecilia adjusted her hold without looking down. "Mr. Aldrich," she said. "The first time you came to me, you told me the water situation was complicated. You said it in a way designed to make me feel uncertain." She looked at him. "I'm going to tell you something in return plainly the way I prefer. I know what your filing says. I know what Fetterman's objection says. I know where the survey data stands, and I know what the county water law says about prior use by natural persons for domestic need. I also know what you did to the Marshfield family, and the Johnsons before that." Aldrich's expression changed. The performing warmth went away, and what was underneath it was harder and less pleasant. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "I didn't accuse you of anything," she said. "I told you what I know. There's a difference." She met his gaze without any effort because holding a sleeping child made certain things easier. It was harder to be unsettled when you were holding something that needed you to be steady. "I'm not selling. I'm not moving. And every conversation we have from here forward will be documented and provided to Fetterman in writing." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to make this difficult," he said. "I'm going to make it accurate," she said, "which may feel the same way from where you're standing." He looked at the cabin once more. Then he looked down the road toward the Barrett ranch as if he were calculating something. "Barrett's been spending time here," he said. "He has. That's going to look a certain way to people." "People can look at it however they like," she said. Aldrich turned his horse. "Think about what I said." "I have," she said. "I'm done thinking about it." He rode. She sat in the doorway and held her daughter and listened to the hoofbeats until they faded, and then she sat in the quiet and thought about what he'd said. Not the offer. The other thing. Barrett's been spending time here. That's going to look a certain way to people. It was a specific kind of pressure, the suggestion that her reputation was a thing she should be managing carefully, that the presence of a man on her property implied something that would be used against her. She understood what he was doing. She also understood sitting there with Clara against her chest, that she was no longer afraid of it. Ethan came that evening, and she told him what Aldrich had said. All of it, including the last part. He was quiet. "He's trying to isolate you," he said. "I know. If he can make you feel like my being here is a liability." "I know what he's doing," she said. "I'm telling you because you should know he said it, not because it changes anything." He looked at her, the gray eyes that she was still learning to read. "It doesn't change anything for me either," he said. "Good." Clara made a sound from the folded blanket where she was sleeping near the camp stove. They both looked at her. The instinct to look was immediate in both of them, and it happened before either of them thought about it. Ethan looked at the child with an expression that did the complicated thing Cecilia had been watching it do since the morning Clara was born. The grief and the something else both present, neither canceling the other. "She looks like you," he said. "People say that. Pearl said it. May said it." He paused. "I said it to myself 3 days ago, but this is the first time I've said it out loud." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about her," she said. "I've been thinking about a lot of things," he said. The quiet that came after that was different from their usual quiet. Their usual quiet was easy, the comfortable kind that came from two people who didn't need noise to fill space. This one had weight to it, the kind of weight that meant something was being decided. "Your family," she said. "You mentioned once they wanted you to go back." He looked at his hands. "My mother, my brother, they're in Denver. They've been in Denver for 7 years since they left the territory. My mother believes the ranch is—" He chose the word carefully, "a form of hiding." "Is it?" I was quiet for a moment. "Maybe it was, for a while." He looked up. "After Clara, after my wife, I came back here because this was the only place I understood how to be." He paused. "But I've been thinking lately that understanding how to be somewhere isn't the same as it being where you belong." She sat with that. "What does your mother want for you?" she said. "A suitable woman, a Denver house, a life that looks right from the outside." He said it without bitterness, just as fact. "She wants me to stop being sad. She thinks those things will accomplish that." "Will they?" "No," he said simply. She looked at Clara. "What would?" she said. The silence stretched. She had not meant the question to be the question it was. Or perhaps she had. She wasn't sure, and the uncertainty itself was information. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I think I'm figuring it out." She did not look at him when he said that. She looked at her daughter, but she heard it. 3 days later, Fetterman sent a letter. She read it twice at the camp stove in the early morning, Clara asleep in the makeshift cradle Ethan had built from scrap lumber and left outside the door one morning without announcement, which was so exactly like him that she had felt something warm and complicated in her chest when she found it. The letter said that the county commissioner had agreed to a full review of Aldrich's water filing, and that the review would include testimony from affected landowners. Fetterman believed, based on the survey data and the prior use documentation, that the Barrett Spring claim would not survive full review. But the process would take 4 to 6 months, and in the interim, Aldrich could make things operationally difficult. He also said something at the end of the letter that she read 3 times. He said that 2 other valley landowners, the Fisks and a family named Crandall, whose land she had not yet visited, had come to his office independently to ask about joining the review process as interested parties. He did not know what had brought them in. He thought she might. She folded the letter. She thought about the Fisk kitchen table and what she'd said. We find out what this valley is willing to do together. Apparently, the valley had decided. She put the letter in the tin box, where she kept her important documents underneath her deed and her water right documentation, and the 2 letters from the time before Montana that she kept, not for sentiment, but for the same reason she kept everything, because they were true, and because true things sometimes needed to be held on to. She picked up Clara, who had woken in the manner of newborns completely and without warning, and held her and thought about what came next. What came next was Aldrich would make things operationally difficult. He had said so himself, in the language of a man telling you something as a threat because he thought you were afraid of threats. She was not afraid. But she was also not without clear eyes about what difficult meant. It meant things that would happen that she would need to be ready for. Problems that would not announce themselves as problems until they had already become them. She was 8 days out from giving birth. She had a cabin with a finished roof and a door that still needed hanging and a barn she hadn't started, and 40 acres that weren't yet earning anything. She had a daughter who was 8 days old and who would need to be on the land when the land needed working. She had a valley that was beginning slowly to decide to hold together, and she had a man who had built a cradle and left it outside her door without asking for credit, who had said, "I don't know yet, but I think I'm figuring it out," and whose face did the complicated thing every time he looked at her daughter. She sat in the early morning with Clara and thought about the word trust. She thought about what it had cost her. What it had cost her to build the walls she had built against it, and what it would cost her to take them down. She thought about the things she had said to Clara on her first night alone in the new cabin, while Pearl slept in the corner and Ethan sat outside in the dark with "May, I'm working on it." She was still working on it. But she was beginning to think that working on it might not be something she had to do alone anymore. Outside the cabin, the morning was coming in clear and sharp and hot. Montana summer, relentless and demanding, and also in the early hours before the heat settled in completely without apology. She had come to respect that about it. The land here did not pretend. It was what it was, and if you understood what it was and worked with it accordingly, it would hold you. She intended to hold it back. Clara made a sound against her shoulder, small and serious. An announcement. "I know," Cecilia said. "I know." She got up. She started the stove. She began the day. And somewhere on the other side of the ridge, on 2,000 acres of mountain ranch that had been worked in grief and solitude for 12 years, a man was beginning his day too. And for the first time in a long time, he was beginning it. Thinking not just about what the land needed from him, but about what he needed, and where more and more clearly he believed he was going to find it. Clara was 3 weeks old when the fence came down. Cecilia heard it before she saw it, a sound that was wrong in the specific way that sounds on a working property were wrong when something structural had failed. She was inside the cabin feeding Clara in the early morning quiet, and she heard the particular crack and drag of a post pulling loose from ground, and she knew before she got to the door what she was going to find. The eastern fence line. 40 feet of it, the section that ran closest to the boundary with the Aldrich North Range. Posts pulled clean from the ground, wire dragged aside, and through the gap, moving with the unhurried confidence of cattle that had been pointed in a direction, 6 head of Aldrich stock spreading out across her southeast corner. She stood in the doorway with Clara against her shoulder and looked at it. She had been expecting something like this. Fetterman had said operationally difficult, and she had understood what that meant. Not legal attacks, not direct confrontation, but the slow accumulation of small damages that added up to a life made harder than it needed to be. A fence down. Cattle on her land. The implication of accident. Nothing that could be easily proven as deliberate. She laid Clara in the cradle Ethan had made, took her rifle from beside the door, and went to deal with the cattle. She didn't shoot them. She moved them the way she had learned to move. Stubborn animals steadily without panic, using her body and her voice, and the rifle as a presence rather than a threat. It took the better part of an hour to push all 6 back through the gap, and when they were through she stood at the broken fence line and looked at the posts. They had not fallen. The ground around each base was disturbed in the particular way that ground was disturbed when a post was worked loose deliberately by human hands, rather than failing gradually from rot or weather. She studied it with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, and she was certain. She went back inside. She wrote it down, the time, the damage, the condition of the ground around the posts, the number of cattle, and their brand. She wrote it in the precise, detailed way that Fetterman had asked her to write everything. Then she put Clara on her back in the carrying cloth Pearl had shown her how to make, and she went out to repair the fence. She was on the 3rd post, driving it back into the hole she had dug with the tamping bar, when she heard a horse on the road and looked up to see Will Ethan's youngest hand pulling up fast. "Miss Hargrove, Mr. Barrett sent me to check the east line. He saw riders near your boundary before sunup." She looked at the post in her hand. "Tell him the fence is down. Aldrich cattle came through. I've got them back and I'm making the repair." She paused. "Tell him I have documentation." Will looked at the fence. At her with Clara on her back and the tamping bar in her hands. He was 22 years old, and she could see him trying to find the right expression for the situation and not quite landing on one. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "do you want help?" "Yes," she said. "Get on the other side of that post and hold it plumb while I pack the base." He got off his horse and held the post. Ethan arrived an hour later with Tom, his senior hand, and a load of fencing supplies in the back of the small wagon. He pulled up to where she was finishing the last section and looked at what she'd done. 5 posts, reset wire, retightened the gap closed, and he looked at it for a moment without saying anything. "The 6th post needs a new hole," she said. "The original was too shallow. It was always going to be a weak point." He got down from the wagon, looked at the ground around the base. "Someone worked this loose," he said. "Yes, I documented it." She shifted Clara in the carrying cloth. The baby was awake now, looking at the world with the serious and slightly indignant expression she had worn since birth, as if she had arrived with opinions and was waiting for the appropriate moment to share them. "Fetterman gets a written account by end of day." "This is going to keep happening," Ethan said. "I know." Howe was quiet for a moment. He picked up the post bar and began working the new hole for the 6th post, and she didn't tell him he didn't have to because they were past that. Now the 2 of them passed the particular protocol of offering and declining. He worked, and she worked, and Tom worked, and Will worked, and by noon, the fence line was solid in a way it hadn't been since she bought the land. Tom, who was perhaps 50, and had been with the Barrett Ranch for 8 years, and said fewer words per day than even Ethan, looked at the finished line and said, "Good work." And it was addressed to Cecilia as clearly as if he had used her name. She found to her mild surprise that it mattered to her. The second incident came 4 days later. Someone moved her boundary markers. Not far, 3 feet in 2 locations along the northern edge of her property. Far enough that when she walked the line in the early morning, as she had begun doing every few days, the stakes were not where she had put them. She found the original holes without difficulty, because she had paid attention when the stakes went in, and she paid attention to the ground around them, and the discrepancy was unmistakable. She stood at the misplaced marker and felt something she had been careful not to let become the primary thing: anger. Not the hot, impulsive kind. The cold, precise kind that came from watching someone do something deliberately wrong and being very clear about what they were doing. She reset the markers to their correct positions. She documented the original holes and the new positions and the distance between them. She wrote it down. Then she went to see Fetterman herself. She left Clara with Pearl, which was the first time she had left Clara with anyone, and the leaving felt like putting down a weight that had become part of her posture. Noticeable, not because it was heavy, but because it was suddenly gone. She drove to town with the documentation folded in her apron pocket, and she went straight up the stairs above the dry goods store without stopping to speak to anyone on the street. Fetterman read what she'd written. He read it twice. "This is good," he said. "This is very good. Each incident alone is deniable. Together they establish a pattern." "Is the pattern enough?" she said. "For the water review, number, for a separate complaint about harassment and interference with property rights." "Possibly." He set the papers down. "I want to be honest with you, Miss Hargrove. The water review is going well. The survey data is strong. But Aldrich has a relationship with the county commissioner that predates the legal question, and relationships influence outcomes in ways that evidence sometimes doesn't." She looked at him. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that the legal argument is sound, but legal arguments are not always sufficient." He folded his hands. "Is there anything else in your position that we could bring to bear? Witnesses, additional landowner support, anything that shifts the political calculation?" She thought about the Fisks, the Crandalls, the fact that they had gone to Fetterman independently. "How many valley landowners would we need?" she said. "For a joint filing that carries weight 6, 8 would be better." He looked at her. "You would need people willing to put their names on a document." She nodded slowly. "Give me 2 weeks," she said. She talked to the Fisks first because she knew them. Then the Crandalls, a family of 4, working 120 acres to the northwest. Quiet people who had been in the valley for 9 years and had watched Aldrich's expansion with the particular wariness of people who recognized a pattern but had not been directly in its path. Yet. Albert Crandall listened to her in the yard of his property with his wife standing beside him, and he was quiet for a long time after she finished. "You're asking us to put our name on a document against Aldrich," he said. "I'm asking you to put your name on a document stating what's true about your land and your water situation," she said. "What that document is used for is Fetterman's business." Albert looked at his wife. His wife said, "How many others?" "The Fisks. Possibly 3 others I haven't spoken to yet." She looked at them both. "I'm not going to pretend there's no risk. There is. But I think there's more risk in letting him move through this valley, one property at a time." Albert's wife looked at him with the expression of a woman who had already made her decision and was waiting to see if her husband had made the same one. He had. "All right," he said. She got 5 names in 10 days. The 6th came from an unexpected direction. Ruth Calloway came to find her. Ruth drove her own wagon out to the Callan parcel on a Tuesday morning and came to the door of the cabin with a directness that was entirely characteristic and said, "I heard what you're doing." "Word travels," Cecilia said. "In Harlow Creek it travels before you finish doing it." Ruth looked at her steadily. "I want to add my name." Cecilia looked at her. "You don't own land, Ruth." "I own the building my store is in," Ruth said. "I've owned it for 16 years. Aldrich made me an offer on it 3 years ago, and I told him what he could do with his offer." She paused. "I have a deed and a water connection to the town's supply that Aldrich has been maneuvering to influence for 2 years. Fetterman can tell you whether that's relevant." Fetterman said it was relevant. 6 names became 7, and Ruth Calloway's name in Harlow Creek carried the specific weight of a woman who had been there longer than most people and was not known to make decisions lightly. When Cecilia brought the signed documents to Fetterman's office, he read each one and then looked up at her over the last page. "How did you do this in 10 days?" he said. "I asked people," she said, "and I told them the truth." I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have the joint filing prepared by Thursday. This changes the calculus significantly." She rode home in the heat of the afternoon, feeling something she had to be careful with because it wasn't victory. There was no victory yet, and she was not a woman who confused momentum with outcomes. But it was close to something. Close to the feeling she had when the north wall went up plumb and level, when the roof decking was done, when the doorframe held. The feeling of something built correctly, from the right materials, in the right order. She told Ethan that evening. He listened without interrupting, which was always how he listened, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment, in the way that meant he was thinking about it rather than performing reaction. 7 names, he said. 7, including Ruth. Ruth is worth 3 on her own. That's what I thought. He looked at Clara, who was in the cradle nearby, doing the thing she had recently begun doing, watching. Her eyes tracking movement and light, with an attention that seemed disproportionate to her size. She was a baby who seemed to be studying things, and Cecilia found this characteristic both recognizable and slightly alarming. "My brother is coming," Ethan said. She looked at him. "From Denver. My mother sent word 2 weeks ago. James is coming to look at the ranch." He paused. "To evaluate whether I should sell it." The words landed in a particular way in the quiet of the cabin. "Should you?" she said. "No," he said immediately. Then more slowly, "That's not my mother believes I'm wasting my life here. James comes to make the case in person because she thinks I'll listen to him in a way I won't listen to letters." He looked at this cradle. "He's not wrong that I've been—" He stopped. "Hiding," she said. He looked at her. "Yes. You told me that yourself, weeks ago." "I know I did." He was quiet. "James will see the ranch, and he'll see—" He stopped again. She waited. "He'll see that things have changed," Ethan said. "That I've been spending time here. He'll have opinions." "What kind of opinions?" "The concerned kind. The kind that come from someone who loves you and is afraid for you." He looked at her directly. "And possibly the kind that come from a man who sees his brother getting close to a woman he doesn't know with a child she won't explain and thinks he understands what that means." Cecilia held that for a moment. "What does it mean?" she said. The question sat between them. Ethan looked at Clara. At the cabin walls. At his own hands. "I don't know how to say it without getting it wrong," he said. "Try," she said. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he might not try, and she had decided she wasn't going to push when he said, "I came to your land the first time because I was curious. That's true. And I came back because the work needed doing, and I could see that, and being useful is—" He paused. "Something I understand how to be." He looked at her. "But I've been coming back for a long time now for reasons that have nothing to do with the work." She didn't say anything. "I know you're not—" He stopped. Started again. "I know what independence means to you. I know what it cost you to build it. I'm not asking you to give that up or change it or—" He pressed his hand flat against his knee, the gesture of a man trying to organize something difficult. "I'm saying that when I'm here, I'm not somewhere else wishing I were. And I haven't been able to say that about any place or any—" He didn't finish the sentence. Clara made a small sound. They both looked at her. She had reached up and grabbed her own hand with the other and appeared to find this development fascinating. "Her name," Ethan said. "When you named her Clara. I need to tell you something about that." "You don't have to. I want to." He looked at the baby. "Clara, my wife, she wanted children very much. We had been married 2 years when she got sick. We had talked about—" He stopped. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that cost something. "She would have been a good mother. She would have liked—" He stopped again. "She would have liked you. I know that without question." Cecilia felt something in her chest that she did not allow herself to look at directly for the same reason you didn't look directly at certain kinds of light. Not because they were dangerous, but because they required a kind of adjustment she wasn't sure she was ready for yet. "I'm glad of that," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking you to feel anything you don't feel or want anything you don't want. I'm just—" He looked at his hands again. "I'm telling you the truth. Because you've always told me the truth, and I think you deserve the same." She thought about what she felt. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything without flinching away from the parts that were complicated, or the parts that were frightening, or the parts she didn't have neat language for. What she felt, sitting in the cabin she had built with her own hands, with her daughter in the cradle, a man had built and left without asking for credit. Listening to that man tell her the truth. What she felt was not simple. It was layered in the way that real things were layered. It had fear in it, the specific fear of someone who had been hurt in a way that changed the architecture of how they moved through the world. It had something else in it, too. Something she had not expected to feel this soon or possibly ever, and that she had been watching grow in the quiet spaces of the past weeks with the careful attention of someone who did not want to be surprised by their own heart. "Your brother James," she said. "When does he come?" Ethan blinked. The shift in subject had surprised him. "Next week," he said. "Bring him here," she said. He looked at her. "You want to meet him?" "I want him to meet me," she said. "There's the difference." Something crossed his face that she now recognized. The thing that was not a smile, and also was not a smile. "All right," he said. James Barrett arrived on a Wednesday. She heard about it from Will, who came by to help with a section of foundation work she was laying for the barn. The next project already begun, because there was always a next project, and the cattle she intended to run would need shelter before the season turned. Will mentioned it in the way young men mention things when they were uncertain whether it was their business to mention them. "Mr. Barrett's brother got in this morning," Will said. "From Denver." "I know," she said. "Hand me that level." He handed her the level. She thought about James Barrett on and off for the rest of the afternoon, not with anxiety exactly, but with the particular preparatory attention she gave to things she knew were coming and wanted to face from the right position. She had been sized up by people her entire life. She knew how to stand still and let it happen. What she wanted when James Barrett looked at her was for him to see what was actually there and not what he expected. They came the following morning. Ethan rode ahead, and James Barrett came behind in a rented buggy, which told her something about him before she saw his face. A man who traveled in a rented buggy in this kind of country was either unused to it or making a statement about his relationship to it. James was younger than Ethan by perhaps 6 years and looked less like him than she had expected, lighter in coloring, with an ease in his expression that his brother did not have the ease of a man who had grown up in cities and found them agreeable. He was not unfriendly. He was assessing her with a thoroughness he was not quite hiding, and she respected him for not quite hiding it, because hidden assessment was more difficult to answer than visible assessment. She was in the barn foundation when they arrived. Clara was on her back. She had a trowel in her hand. James looked at the cabin, at the barn foundation, at her with the child on her back and mortar on her hands. "Miss Hargrove," he said. "James Barrett." "I know," she said. "Your brother mentioned you were coming." She did not put the trowel down. "I'd shake your hand, but I'm in the middle of something." He looked at the foundation work. "What are you building?" he said. "A barn, 40 by 20. I need it before October." She set a stone and checked the level. "I understand you're here to talk to your brother about the ranch." He glanced at Ethan, who was standing to the side with the expression of a man who had known this was going to happen and had made his peace with it in advance. "Among other things," James said. "He should keep it," she said. She set another stone. "I'll tell you why if you want to know." James looked at her steadily. Then, with something that was close to genuine surprise, "All right," she told him. Concisely, because she was in the middle of foundation work, and conciseness was her natural mode in any case. She told him about the water situation, about Aldrich, about the 7-name joint filing, and what Fetterman said about its strength. She told him what the valley had been before and what it was beginning to become. She told him that the Barrett Ranch's position was not incidental to any of it, that its size and its water rights and its 12 years of operation were part of the structural integrity of what the valley could be. "If Ethan sells," she said, "Aldrich buys it, or controls it within a year, and then this," she gestured with the trowel indicating herself and the cabin and the barn foundation, "and the 40 acres doesn't survive. Not because I can't fight, but because you don't win a water war against a man who controls the high ground and the primary source." James was quiet. "You've thought about this," he said. "I think about everything," she said. "It's how I do things." He looked at his brother. Ethan looked back at him with an expression that said very clearly, without words, "I told you." James looked at the barn foundation, at the cabin behind it, at the level line of the south wall and the true square of the door frame and the finished roof. "You built that yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. "Most of it," she said. "Your brother held a board once." Ethan made a sound. She had come to know that sound. The sound that was almost a laugh, in the way that a man who did not laugh easily made a sound that was as close to one as he was going to get. James heard it. He looked at his brother with an expression she couldn't entirely read, but there was something in it that was not disapproval. He stayed for 2 hours. He looked at the ranch books when Ethan offered them. James was apparently an accountant in Denver, which explained the rented buggy and the careful assessment, and he asked questions that were specific and intelligent, and that Cecilia, listening from across the table while she fed Clara, answered whenever they were directed at her without hesitation. When he left, he shook her hand. She had washed it by then, and he said, "Miss Hargrove, I understand better now." "What do you understand?" she said. He glanced at his brother, then back at her. "Why he's not hiding anymore," he said. He got into the rented buggy and drove back toward Harlow Creek. In the quiet after his wheels faded, Ethan stood in the yard and looked at the ground, and she could see him deciding something. "He's going to tell my mother," he said. "I know," she said. "She'll want to come see for herself." "Let her come," she said. He looked up. "You're not worried about that. I'm worried about the Aldrich filing and the barn roof, and the fact that Clara has started refusing to sleep before midnight," she said. "Your mother I'll manage when she gets here." He looked at her for a long moment. "Cecilia," he said. "What?" He walked toward her, and he stopped at a distance that was different from their usual distance, closer. Not dramatically closer, but close enough that the change was unmistakable and deliberate. "I'm going to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know that the answer doesn't change anything. I'll be here tomorrow the same way I was here today. That's not conditional." She looked at him. "Ask it." "Is there room," he said, "for what I feel?" "Not right now. I'm not asking you to answer right now. I'm asking if there's room for it, in whatever you're building here." She thought about what she had told herself that evening weeks ago, sitting outside the cabin in the dark. The question that kept her awake. Whether she had enough left in her, enough of the capacity that had been damaged in the breaking to trust someone. She had been building the answer to that question ever since. Stone by stone, post by post, the same way she built everything. "Yes," she said. "There's room." He stood very still. "That's enough," he said. "It's not everything," she said. "Not yet. I need you to know that." "I know that. And I need you to not require it to be everything yet." "I don't," he said. "I'm not in a hurry." He paused. "I've been patient with difficult ground before." She looked at him. "That's possibly the most rancher thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. The sound he made this time was definitively a laugh. Not a long one, not a performed one. Just a real sound, the kind that came from genuine surprise, and it changed his face into something she had not seen before and very much wanted to see again. Clara on her back chose that moment to make a loud and decisive sound of her own. They both looked at each other, and then at the baby, and then Cecilia said, "She always has to have the last word." "I wonder where she gets that," Ethan said. Cecilia started to say something, and then did not, because he was right, and she knew it, and there was no useful response to being accurately observed by someone who was paying the right kind of attention. She turned back to the barn foundation instead. "Are you going to help with this or not?" she said. He picked up the second trowel that was sitting on the supply board. "Tell me where you want it," he said. She told him, and they built. The joint filing landed on the county commissioner's desk on a Thursday morning. Fetterman sent word to Cecilia, by way of Will, who had become something of an unofficial courier between the Barrett Ranch and the Callan parcel. Over the past weeks, a role he had slipped into without being asked, and seemed to find agreeable, possibly because it gave him reason to stop by and look at Clara, who had recently discovered that she could make a sound that was not quite a word, but was clearly an attempt at one, and who applied this discovery indiscriminately to anyone within range. 7 signatures. The Fisks, the Crandalls. 3 other families whose names had come in during the final week through the particular network of trust that Cecilia had been building one kitchen table at a time. Ruth Calloway, And at the bottom, in the careful handwriting of a woman who had learned that precision in writing was the same as precision in everything else, Cecilia May Hargrove. Fetterman's note said, "The Commissioner cannot ignore this. It doesn't guarantee the outcome, but it changes the room he makes his decision in." She read the note twice, folded it, put it in the tin box with everything else. Then she went back to work on the barn. The barn was going up faster than the cabin had, partly because she had learned things in the building of the cabin that she applied to the barn from the start. The sequencing, the order of operations, the places where trying to do it alone cost more time than it saved. Partly because she was not alone. Ethan came 3 mornings a week now. Will came when he could. Ed Fisk had appeared one Saturday with his 2 oldest sons and spent the day on the frame without being asked. And the following Saturday, Albert Crandall had done the same, and she had understood without it being said that this was the valley deciding what kind of place it was, not in a declaration, but in the accumulated weight of people showing up. Pearl came too, though not for the barn. Pearl came for Clara, and for the particular kind of company that did not require performance, and she brought May, who had appointed herself Clara's primary observer, and reported on all developmental progress to anyone who would listen with the seriousness of a naturalist documenting a new species. She tracked my hand all the way across. May announced one afternoon, demonstrating by moving her hand slowly in front of Clara's face, while Clara's eyes followed it with intense concentration. "Both directions. I timed it. She's fast." "She is," Cecilia said. "She's going to be smart," May said with the certainty of someone who had conducted a thorough assessment. "God help us," Pearl said from across the room. Cecilia looked at her daughter following May's hand and felt the complicated layered thing she felt when she looked at Clara. The love that had no bottom to it, and underneath the love, something that was almost disbelief. Not at the child, at herself, at the fact that she had built this. Not just the cabin and the barn and the water rights filing and the 7 signatures. This, the room full of people, the child on the floor, the barn going up outside, the man who came 3 mornings a week and held posts and drove nails and was patient with difficult ground. She had built this from nothing. She allowed herself to feel that for exactly as long as it took Pearl to hand her a cup of coffee, and then she moved on because there was still the north side of the barn roof to consider. Aldrich made his move on a Tuesday, and he made it in a direction nobody had anticipated. Fetterman sent a rider not. Will this time a man from his own office, which meant it was urgent enough that Fetterman wasn't trusting the message to the usual channel. Cecilia was on the barn roof when the rider came. She climbed down and read the letter standing on the ground with the rider waiting. Aldrich had gone around the commissioner. He had filed a separate action with the territorial court in Helena, a claim that the Barrett water rights documentation contained a survey error that predated Ethan's ownership, which, if true, would place the spring's legal status in dispute, not just with Cecilia's right of use, but with the Barrett Ranch's own water security. The territorial court had accepted the filing for review. The review could take 6 months to a year. In the interim, the court had the authority to issue a provisional restriction on water use from the disputed source. Cecilia read the letter again. She understood immediately what Aldrich had done. The county filing was a defensive action, 7 signatures strong survey data, Fetterman's legal argument. Aldrich had responded by changing the battlefield entirely. He had moved the fight to a level where relationships with county commissioners did not apply, where the timeline was longer, where the costs would be higher. He had stopped trying to pressure individual landowners and had gone straight for the structural foundation, the Barrett Spring. If the territorial court issued a provisional restriction, Ethan couldn't use his own water. And if Ethan couldn't use his water, the Barrett Ranch, 2,000 acres, 300 head, was in serious trouble before the summer even broke. Cecilia told the rider she understood, and to tell Fetterman she would be in town tomorrow morning. She went back up to the barn roof. She drove 3 more nails before Ethan arrived. He had gotten word from Fetterman, too. He came fast, the particular pace she had learned to associate with him, having made a decision and executing it, not with anger, but with intention. He stood at the base of the barn and looked up at her. "Come down," he said. "I'm almost done with this section." "Cecilia." She drove the last nail, came down. He handed her the letter from Fetterman without preamble. She handed him hers. They traded and read in silence. "He's going after your ranch," she said. "He's going after both of us through the ranch," Ethan said. "He knows he can't win the county filing. This is his pivot." "How serious is the survey error claim?" He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant the answer was not simple. "The original survey was done in 1869, he said. "My father commissioned it. I've had no reason to question it in 12 years. He folded the letter precisely. But surveys from that period were not always precise. Aldrich has been in this territory longer than I have. If he found something in the original survey documentation. Has Fetterman seen the survey? Not the original, the county copy. Get him the original, she said immediately. Today, whatever it takes. He looked at her. I know where it is, he said. It's in the ranch records. He paused. If there's an error in it. Then we find out now, she said. Not in 6 months when the territorial court has already issued a provisional restriction. He looked at her for a long moment. You understand what it means if the survey is wrong? Yes. It means the spring's legal status is genuinely uncertain. Not just disputed by Aldrich, actually uncertain. Yes, she said again. And I'd rather know that today and find a way to fight it than find it out in Helena with 6 months of restriction already in place. She looked at him steadily. Go get the survey. He went. She spent that night after Clara was down, doing something she had not done since the early weeks on the land. She sat with her fear, and she looked at it directly, because the fear was real. If the Barrett Spring was legally compromised, her domestic use right was the first thing to go. And without reliable water through the summer. Her garden, which was established now, and producing the first real production from the land, would fail. The cattle she had bought, 6 head purchased last week from a rancher 2 valleys over, who was thinning his herd, they would need reliable water before fall. Without it, she would lose the season's work. Without the season's work, she was buying supplies on a reserve that would not last through winter. She had money. Not much, but enough. She had managed it with the same precision she managed everything. But enough was not the same as enough if multiple things failed at once. She sat with that, and she did not flinch away from it, and she did not panic, because panic was not useful, and she had never once allowed it to be. She thought about what she had, what she could control, and what she needed to find out. What she could control: the barn, which was 3/4 done, and would be done before October, regardless. The garden, which she could water from the seasonal creek at reduced volume if necessary. The documentation, which was solid. The 7 signatures, which were real people who had made real decisions. What she needed to find out: the survey. She went to sleep at 10. Clara woke her at 2. She fed her daughter in the dark, and listened to the quiet of the valley, and thought about her father handing over the deed when she was 17, and about the fact that she had come here specifically so that would never happen to her, and about what she was willing to do to make sure it didn't. Everything was the answer. She was willing to do everything. Ethan came in the morning with the survey. He spread it on the cabin floor. It was a large document, hand-drawn with notations in the script of a surveyor who had been working fast and in conditions that made precision difficult. She crouched over it with him, and they read it together, and she was glad she had spent those 2 afternoons in the county records office when she arrived, because the language of survey documents was not intuitive, and she had learned enough of it to follow what she was looking at. They found it in the 3rd quadrant notation. A measurement that was marked as estimated rather than verified. A single word, est. Next to the figure that established the eastern boundary of the spring's catchment area. It was a small notation. Easy to miss. Fetterman had not caught it because he had only seen the county copy, which had been transcribed without the notation. Est, estimated. Aldrich had found it. Of course he had. He had been looking for 3 years, and he had found the one word in an old survey document that could shift the ground under everything. Cecilia sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long moment. He's had this for years, she said. Probably, Ethan said. His voice was even, but she could hear the thing underneath it. How was waiting, she said. He let the county filing happen. He waited to see if we were serious, and when he saw the 7 signatures, he played this. She looked at Ethan. He was always going to play this. Yes. Which means he's been more afraid of us than he let on. She heard herself say us, and registered it, and moved past it, because it was accurate, and accuracy was what mattered now. He's not doing this because he's winning. He's doing this because he's not. Ethan looked at her. That's, he started. True, she said. The question is what we do about that one notation. He was quiet for a moment. Get a new survey done. How long does that take? With the right surveyor, 3 weeks for this property, maybe 4. The territorial court filing is 60 days before they schedule a review hearing, she said. Fetterman told me that in his letter, which means if we get a new survey in 3 weeks and file it as a response to the territorial claim, we're inside the window. Ethan looked at the document on the floor. The surveyor I'd want is in Bozeman. Then send for him today. He looked up at her. It's expensive. I know. She met his gaze. Split it with me. He was very still. You don't have to do that, he said. The spring is the water source for my domestic use, she said. Your legal problem is my legal problem. If we fix the survey, we fix the problem for both of us. She paused. Unless you have a reason to keep the costs separate. He held her gaze for a moment. No, he said. I don't. Then split it with me. She stood up. Send for the surveyor. He sent for the surveyor. The letter from Denver came the same week. She knew it was from Denver because Ethan brought it himself rather than sending Will, and he brought it in the manner of a man carrying something he wasn't sure how to set down. He handed it to her outside the barn, where she was working on the loft framing, and she read it standing on the ladder with Clara on her back. It was from his mother. Margaret Barrett wrote in the precise, controlled hand of a woman who had grown up being told that a lady's writing reflected her character, and who had taken that lesson seriously enough that you could see it in every line, the careful spacing, the deliberate word choice, the complete absence of anything that could be called imprecision. It was also underneath all of that control, the letter of a woman who was afraid. Not of Cecilia specifically, of what Cecilia represented. Of her son choosing a life that looked from Denver like more of the same solitude he had been choosing for 12 years. She was coming in September. Cecilia handed the letter back to Ethan. She writes well, she said. He looked at her. That's your response. She loves you, she said. She's afraid you're making another choice that's going to isolate you. She's wrong about what you're choosing, but she's not wrong about the fear. She went back up the ladder. Tell her she's welcome. Cecilia. Ethan. She looked down at him from the ladder. I have built this from nothing in a country that told me I couldn't. I have filed legal documents and gathered 7 signatures and split a survey cost with a man who built my daughter a cradle and left it outside the door without asking for credit. I am not afraid of your mother. She paused. Hand me that board. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the board and held it up. She took it, set it, drove the nail. Thank you, she said. Any time, he said. And the way he said it had nothing to do with the board. The surveyor arrived from Bozeman on a Thursday and spent 3 days on the Barrett eastern boundary. His name was Calhoun, and he was a meticulous man of perhaps 55, who did not speak much, but whose instruments were the finest she had seen, and who she learned from Fetterman later had been the surveyor of record on 6 territorial court cases, and had never had his work successfully challenged. She walked the boundary with him on the second day with Clara on her back and the carrying cloth she had gotten expert at tying. Calhoun did not comment on the baby or on her. He asked her 2 questions about the original survey notation, and she answered them precisely. He nodded and went back to his instruments. On the evening of the 3rd day, he sat at the table in Ethan's ranch house with Ethan and Cecilia and his completed preliminary measurements, and he said, the original surveyor estimated the eastern catchment boundary because there was a seasonal marsh in that quadrant at the time that made direct measurement impossible. The estimate was reasonable, but not verified. He spread his preliminary notes. My measurements establish the actual boundary at 11 feet east of the estimated position. This places the spring's catchment origin fully within the Barrett deed. He looked at both of them. There is no ambiguity in the current data. There was only ambiguity in the original notation. The silence in the room had a particular quality. That's what we bring to the territorial court, Cecilia said. Yes, Fetterman said. He had come to hear the results directly, which was the kind of thing Fetterman did that she had come to respect. He didn't wait for reports when he could be present. Calhoun's survey supersedes the original. With this filed as a response to Aldrich's claim, the territorial court has no basis to issue a provisional restriction. Ethan looked at Calhoun. How long to finalize? A week, Calhoun said. File it the day it's ready, Cecilia said to Fetterman. Fetterman looked at her with the expression she had first seen weeks ago when she had produced 7 signatures in 10 days. The expression of a man revising upward. Yes, he said. I will. The county commissioner issued his decision 2 weeks later. Aldrich's original water claim, the one that had started everything. The spring access dispute that Thomas Aldrich had been building toward for 3 years was denied. The 7-signature joint filing, combined with the existing Barrett water rights documentation, was sufficient to establish that Aldrich's prior claim lacked the verified basis required under territorial water law. Fetterman brought the decision to her himself. He drove out to the Callan parcel on a Friday morning and handed her the paper at the door of the finished barn, where she had been checking the loft framing before she let the cattle in for the first time. She read it. She read it again. It's done, she said. The county claim is done, Fetterman said. Aldrich can still pursue the territorial filing, but with Calhoun's survey in the record, his basis for that claim is now substantially weaker than when he filed it. My professional expectation is that he withdraws rather than take it to a hearing he is not likely to win. He paused. This is not a guarantee. Nothing is a guarantee, she said. No, he said. But this is a very good outcome. She stood with the paper in her hands and looked at it, and then looked at the barn, and then at the cabin, and then at her 40 acres of Montana ground that were no longer just hard and dry and contested, but were producing things. The garden was in the cattle, wherein the water was running, and the walls she had built were standing true and straight. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Fetterman." "Miss Hargrove," he said. "In my 23 years of practice, I have not met a client who prepared documentation the way you do." He was quiet a moment. It was a pleasure. He drove back to town. She went inside and put the decision in the tin box. She put it on top of the deed. On top of the water right documentation. On top of the list she had made, and Fetterman's notes, and the original filing, and everything else she had gathered and organized and held on to, because true things needed to be held on to. She closed the box. She picked up Clara, who had been watching from the cradle, with her usual expression of intense developmental concentration. "We're not going anywhere," she said. Clara grabbed her finger. Margaret Barrett arrived on a September morning when the first coolness had begun to find its way into the early hours, the first suggestion of what was coming, not the brutal summer heat anymore, but something that had an edge to it, the reminder that Montana had seasons and that the seasons did not negotiate. She was smaller than Cecilia had expected. Not frail. There was nothing frail about Margaret Barrett, who at 62 carried herself with the posture of a woman who had decided decades ago what she was and had not seen reason to revise the decision. But small. Precise. With eyes that were Ethan's color and his quality difficult to read quickly and worth reading carefully. Ethan met his mother in town and brought her out in the wagon, and he was quiet on the drive in the way he was quiet when he was preparing himself for something. Margaret sat beside him and did not speak either, which was its own kind of information. When they pulled into the Callan parcel, Cecilia was at the garden. She did not stop what she was doing when the wagon arrived. Not from defiance, because the carrots needed thinning, and the carrots did not care about the arrival schedule of anyone's mother, and because stopping everything she was doing when someone arrived was a form of performance she had never been willing to offer. She finished the row she was working. Then she stood, took off her gloves, and walked to the wagon. Margaret Barrett was already down from it. She was looking at the cabin, at the barn, at the garden. She was doing the thing her son did, the genuine assessment, the one that was not performed. Cecilia stopped in front of her. "Mrs. Barrett," she said. "I'm Cecilia Hargrove. Thank you for making the trip." Margaret looked at her, then past her to where Clara was sitting on a folded blanket near the garden edge, doing the thing she did now, picking up small objects and examining them with focused intensity, one at a time, as if cataloging. "That's her," Margaret said. Not a question. "That's Clara," Cecilia said. Margaret walked past her to the blanket. She crouched down at 62, with the ease of a woman who had not stopped using her body just because the years were adding up, and she looked at the child. Clara looked back at her. Margaret extended one finger. Clara grabbed it. Something crossed Margaret's face that Cecilia watched from a careful distance. It was the thing that happened to people when Clara grabbed their finger. The particular thing that was not about the child exactly, but about what the child represented, which was different for every person. For Margaret Barrett. Cecilia thought she understood what it was. The name. The child named after the woman her son had loved and grieved for 12 years. The evidence in the grip of small fingers that her son had not been hiding, had not been stuck in the way she feared, but had been slowly in his own way finding his way back toward something. Margaret stood up. She turned and looked at Cecilia, and then she looked at the cabin, and then back at Cecilia again. "You built that," she said. "Yes." "He said you built it yourself." "Most of it. He held a board once." Behind her she heard the sound. Ethan. The almost laugh. She did not turn around. Margaret's expression did something she had not expected. It softened. Not entirely. Margaret Barrett was not a woman whose expression softened entirely, but at the edges. "My husband built our first house," she said. "I handed him boards for 3 months." She paused. "He always said I was more useful than any man he ever hired." Cecilia looked at her steadily. "Did he?" "He was right." Margaret looked at the barn. "James said you split the survey cost." "It was my water, too." Margaret nodded slowly. "He said you split it before you knew whether the survey would come out right." "That's when it needed splitting," Cecilia said. Margaret was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was doing something. "He hasn't laughed in a long time," she said. "Ethan, since his wife." She stopped, started again. "James said he laughed, on the visit." "He has a good laugh," Cecilia said. "He's just stingy with it." Something happened in Margaret Barrett's eyes. The thing that had been assessing, evaluating, calculating it, completed its calculation and arrived at a result, and the result was not what Cecilia had braced for. "Miss Hargrove," Margaret said, "would you show me the cabin?" "Yes," Cecilia said. "I would." Margaret stayed 4 days. She slept in the ranch house Ethan had offered the guest room without being asked, and she came to the Callan parcel each morning with Ethan, and she worked. Not decoratively, not as a guest being given things to do. She shelled the dried beans from the garden and helped Cecilia put up the first of the preserves and held the level on a section of barn interior, framing that needed a second pair of hands, and she held it perfectly plumb without being instructed to. On the 3rd day, she held Clara for 2 hours, while Cecilia did the work that could not be done with the baby on her back. And Clara did not protest, which was notable because Clara had developed opinions about who held her and expressed those opinions clearly. On the 4th morning, Margaret stood in the cabin with a cup of coffee and looked at the south wall, the one that got the best light, and she said, "My husband would have liked you." "What was he like?" Cecilia said. "Stubborn," Margaret said. "Certain, not always right but never in doubt." She looked at Cecilia. "You would have argued with him constantly." "Probably," Cecilia said. "He would have loved every minute of it." She took a sip of her coffee. "He raised his sons to be good men. He did not entirely succeed in teaching them to be happy men." She paused. "I think you may be better at that than he was." Cecilia held that carefully. "I'm not trying to make him into something he's not," she said. "I know," Margaret said. That's exactly why I said it." When Margaret left on the fourth morning, she embraced Cecilia in the brief, firm way of a woman who did not waste embraces. "Write to me," she said. "I will," Cecilia said. Margaret held her gaze for a moment. "He's going to ask you eventually," she said, quiet enough that Ethan standing at the wagon could not hear. "When he does, don't make him wait too long. He's patient, but he's not made of stone." She got in the wagon. Cecilia stood in the yard and watched her go and thought about that. The Aldrich territorial filing was withdrawn on a Tuesday in October, which Fetterman communicated by letter that arrived on a Wednesday, and which Cecilia read at the camp stove. She still had the camp stove. She had come to think of it as a permanent fixture with Clara on her knee, and the smell of the first real autumn cold coming in through the open door. Withdrawn. No hearing. No further legal action recorded. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she went outside and stood in the yard and looked at what surrounded her. The finished cabins solid and straight. The finished barn. The cattle already settled in it against the morning cold. The garden done for the season, the beds turned and resting. The fence line on the east solid and correctly staked. The spring 400 yards to the northeast, running clean and cold, legally hers to use. 40 acres of Montana ground that had been nothing when she arrived and was now something. She had done this. She was still doing this. She heard a horse on the road and knew before she looked whose it was. She had learned the particular sound of his approach, the way you learned things when someone had been coming to your place 3 mornings a week for months, not consciously, not deliberately, but in the accumulated way of attention over time. Ethan pulled up to the yard and stepped down and looked at her face, and then he said, "Fetterman's letter." "Yes." "Withdrawn." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the barn, at the garden beds, at the fence line. "It's over," he said. "The legal part," she said. "Aldrich is still in the valley. He's still going to be the man he is." "Yes," Ethan said. "But he knows now what this land will do when he pushes it." She looked at him. "What will your mother say," she said, "when you write to tell her?" He looked at her steadily. "She'll say she knew already." He paused. "She told me before she left that you were the most capable person she had ever met, and that I shouldn't take too long about things." Cecilia thought about what Margaret had said. "He's going to ask you eventually. Don't make him wait too long." She looked at Ethan for a moment. "She told me the same thing," she said. "About you." He went still. "She told you that you're patient but not made of stone," she said, "and that she thought I might be better at making you happy than your father was." She held his gaze. "She's very direct for a woman who writes such controlled letters." He made the sound, the real one, the genuine one she had been collecting since the first time she heard it. Then he took a step toward her. The same deliberate step he had taken weeks ago, the one that was different from their usual distance. "Cecilia," he said, "I know what you're going to ask," she said. "Do you?" "You've been building up to it since you left the cradle outside the door," she said. "Which was, I will point out, extremely unfair. I can take it back." "You cannot take it back," she said. "I've already accepted the cradle." He looked at her with the gray eyes that she could read now that she had been learning to read for months, the same way she had learned everything deliberately, attentively, without hurry. "Then ask me," she said. "Is it enough?" he said. "What's here? What's built? Is it enough to—" He stopped. Tried again. "I told you I wasn't in a hurry. I meant that. But I also told you I was figuring out what I needed, and I have." He looked at the cabin, at the barn, at her. "You are the most certain thing I have found in 12 years, and I would like if you're willing to build whatever comes next beside you. Not for you, not instead of you, beside you." The morning was cold and clear, and the cattle were in the barn, and the spring was running, and the decision she had been building toward stone by stone, the way she built everything, was ready. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. "Yes," she said again, because it was true, and true things were worth saying twice. "But I'm keeping the land in my name." I would expect nothing else, he said. And I'm keeping the camp stove. The camp stove, he said, is non-negotiable, I understand. She looked at him. You're going to have to learn that I am always right about the structural things. You've been right about every structural thing since the gusset plate, he said. I noticed. Good, she said. Remember that. He stepped forward and he took her hand, both hands carefully, the way he did everything, and he stood there in the yard of her 40 acres, with the barn behind him and the cabin behind her. And Clara's voice starting up inside the clear and declarative sound of a child who had woken and had things to say, and he said, I remember everything. She believed him, because he was Ethan Barrett, and he was not a man who said things he did not mean, and she was Cecilia May Hargrove, and she was not a woman who accepted things she did not believe. And they had both learned the hard way, and the long way, and the only way that actually worked, that the strongest things were not built in a day. They were built the way she had built the cabin, the way she had gathered the 7 signatures, the way she had learned his face, and he had learned her silences, and Clara had learned that the world was a place worth paying attention to. One true thing at a time, placed carefully, checked for level, given time to hold. Inside the cabin, Clara's voice grew more insistent. Cecilia looked at Ethan. She has things to say, she said. She always has things to say, he said. She gets that from you. She started toward the door. He came with her the way he had been coming steadily, without being asked, with the particular patience of a man who had finally, after 12 years of solitude and grief, found somewhere he intended to stay. The door of the cabin they had built together, him holding boards, her driving nails, both of them finding out what it meant to build something that was neither his nor hers alone, but something that belonged to the life they had chosen, stood open to the October morning. They went inside. The land held. The water ran. And in the valley below, the Barrett Ridge, in the half-dozen farmhouses, and the one dry goods store, and the legal office above it, where Fetterman kept careful records, the people who had signed their names and shown up on Saturdays and brought bread and held levels and ridden hard to spread word of a woman who had driven nails into raw timber, 7 months pregnant, and had not stopped. Those people went about their work. And the work was good, and the valley that had been one kind of place was becoming slowly, in the way that real things became what they were going to be, a different kind of place entirely. Not because one woman had arrived with a wagon and a toolbox and a dream, but because she had stayed, and because staying, as it turned out, was the bravest thing any of them had ever done.